Kia ora tātou. Charles Waldegrave is my name. I work at the Family Centre and lead the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit. That's part of Anglican Social Services based in the Hutt Valley. And I'm speaking here today about the Welfare Expert Advisory Report, WEAG as it's known, and it's called Whakamana Tāngata, Restoring Dignity to Social Security in New Zealand. For many, many years, the Church has been coming to government and trying to raise issues about the poorest people, the levels of poverty in New Zealand, particularly in terms of income and housing. That combination is fairly lethal for people at the bottom end. And governments have responded in different ways. Of course, there was the Hikoi of Hope back in the late 1980s. And church leaders from all the churches have met regularly with prime ministers, and the church leaders have had advisors. I've been a part of that throughout that whole period, meeting with prime ministers and often different ministers of cabinet and raising many of these issues. What the government has decided to do is to have a whole inquiry into the welfare system with a view to overhauling it. There's a sense in which it's not fit for purpose, people don't get enough money, they're living in poverty, and it's become very punitive. So the whole purpose of a welfare state is to look after the people that aren't able to make a reasonable income and a reasonable living at least a minimal standard through the normal processes. And so we have a system that protects them. Now, if that system is actually not protecting them, then there's a serious problem. And the government set up this WEAG, the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, to look into it. Now, that group consisted of 11 independent experts. I actually was one of them, which is the reason why I'm talking to you. But there were people from the employer, there were 11 of us. There was employer, trade union, there was a paediatrician, there was members from the disabled community, Māori representatives, Pacific representatives, those of us that specialise in poverty and housing, there was economists. So there's a range of people who brought various levels of expertise. We had terms of reference, and the idea was to find out what was the best way to overhaul the system so that it could become fit for purpose. And there's a photograph of the 11 people. I don't really have time on this video to name them all, but that's them there. So the issue is the current welfare system was set up when society was very different. It was set up in the 1930s, and it's no longer fit for purpose. In those days, it was based around a Pākehā nuclear family with one breadwinner. It wasn't at all geared for the later levels of separation and divorce, so the domestic purposes benefit didn't come in until the 1970s. And then later on, of course, under the neoliberal regime with Ruth Richardson's budget in 1991, there was this massive cut to both benefit levels. They were dropped about 20%, and also housing in state houses was moved much closer to a market rent than it was. There was a subsidy, but it's still, most people in cities had to suddenly move from paying 25% of their income on rent to about 40%. Now, it hasn't fundamentally been altered since. Certainly the Working for Families package did help to some extent, but it helped people on benefits less than it helped, proportionally less than it helped people on lower incomes above the benefit and low middle incomes. So we now have got ourselves in quite a serious mess. So there's general agreement that it no longer meets the needs that it was set out, that was established to do, that it's become unmanageable and complex, that far too many people are living in poverty despite receiving help, which is completely against the purpose it was set up for. It was to take them out of poverty, and that it's become punitive with a lot of sanctions, and so people are made to feel that they're not particularly worthy if they're on a benefit, and that side of things it hasn't worked at all. And that's why Whakamana Tāngata is the name of the report. That's the name we chose, Restoring Dignity to Social Security in New Zealand. So what we wanted to do was propose a system based on evidence, the best evidence and research that would whakamana the tangata, that would build up the mana and the dignity of people. It's a commitment to improving their well-being, to re-establish the social security system as something that makes up for the people who can't operate in the market for one reason or another. It can be a health reason, it could be a fact that there's not enough employment at the time, it could be a fact that different skills have been needed and there's a period of time when people need to be covered, whatever the reason, that they can live with dignity as New Zealanders and as of right be entitled to a minimal amount of income that lifts them out of poverty. So, what we found was that the overwhelming evidence was that income is quite inadequate. To give you an example, the minimal, there are various poverty lines that are used throughout the world, but the most minimal one is the OECD one. It's 50% of median income. And most of the benefits are paid at a level around about 40%, well below that level. So it doesn't meet, what are recognised not just in New Zealand, but in other countries as well. It's not covering basic costs, and it's victimising critical people. Māori are much more victimised by the system, so are Pacific Island people, and so too are disabled people. Disabled people really come out in this report as a group of people that have got serious problems in their lives through absolutely no fault of their own, and are yet treated often in quite punitive ways with absolutely minimal income, and it's quite inadequate in terms of trying to address the main issues of it. So the other thing that the evidence shows is that if people live in poverty, you have long-term negative outcomes, particularly for children. Many of the children have cognitive arrest in terms of their development. If they're living with parents who are stressed, they're not able to get adequate nutrition and so on, and there's very good evidence that is happening, then they start compromising their brain development. It certainly compromises school attainment. It leads to greater ill health, many other costs in the system, and it damages emotional and social development. So, what we needed to do was to set up a system, work out how much the income is inadequate, and from there to sort of calculate what's needed. Now, the way we did that was to go through a budget. So we have good evidence about minimal adequate amounts of food. For example, at Otago University in the nutrition department, they have a food cost survey, and they estimate how much is needed for a minimal budget. They do 3 different budgets, the top one being quite a liberal one, but the most modest one, which was the one that we used, sets out the amount of money a household with different numbers of family, with different ages of children in different regions in New Zealand. It has all these different costs of what is required in terms of adequate income for food. We also know exactly what people need to pay for housing in different places because of the rent, the tenancy rent database, which is kept in the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. That records, because when people hand in their deposit, it records the rent in every region and every suburb in New Zealand, so we know exactly how to do that. We also now have good evidence of how much heating is required in different parts of New Zealand. Of course, you need more heat in the south of the South Island than you need in the north of the North Island. And those things have been estimated in research, how much is needed for different sized families and so on. So it was this sort of evidence we pulled together a budget, and we used particularly the work in the New Zealand Poverty Measurement Project, of which I've been very closely involved. I'm one of the leaders of that. Those of us working at the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit and Victoria University School of Government, working with the economists there. And also the work that we'd done in the living wage. With the living wage, we had to develop these budgets, and they had to stand up to scrutiny because we were putting them before businesses and before governments. And there's no way they're going to pay a wage if the research is shonky or if it shows that we're overcharging, overestimating for particular costs like food or electricity or transport or whatever. So we had those basic costs, and we built them into various budgets. And then we worked with officials, and Treasury modelled up the various costs for the various benefits. Now, some benefits were shown to be, at the most, 47% light on what was needed to lift them to a minimum adequate income. Other benefits were as low as 17% light. No benefit was paying adequately. The ones that paid the most generously were 17% light on what was needed. Some of the worst were 47%. Actually, it may surprise you, as it does if you're not working in the field, is that the group that is the most in need, in actual fact, the least paid, the least helped in these circumstances, are single males. That a lot of money has gone to try and restore households with children, sole parent households. They're still not paid adequately, but money has gone to that. But this other group sort of got really behind, and they were the group at 47%. So when you get the whole package and add it together, what it requires, we estimated and are set out in the report, the shortfall is about 5.2 billion per annum, just to get people to meet what the Prime Minister wants, to lift all children out of poverty and to have a country that lives out of poverty. Now, that's one of the problems. The other problem is housing, because once you give income or increase the income for low-income people, the danger is that landlords then lift their prices because you've got a market that's prepared to pay more. And so the money, a big chunk of the money doesn't actually go to the people. It ends up in the range of the ranges of different landlords, from corporate landlords right through to couples that have got one house or two houses that they rent out. Now, most people in this income group, in the low income group that are on benefits, are paying round about 45% of their household income in rent. This is a huge amount. If that's the average, many are paying 50% or more. House price inflation has been double that of income inflation in the last 5 years. So as income increases, housing prices have increased twice the amount each year over the last 5 years. So this makes people extremely vulnerable at the latter end. And the government is currently paying 3.1% of total Crown baseline expenditure on housing. That is, if you add the accommodation supplement, the income-related rent subsidy that is given to people in state houses and some community-based housing, and the extra spending through emergency assistance. It comes to 3.1% of Crown baseline expenditure. It's huge cost to government, and it's a demand-side driven expenditure, and so it's increasing all the time. Now, what is needed is a way to address a systemic housing crisis. We have a problem of affordability, but we also have a problem of demand. We have a major problem of supply. There are not enough houses. But we also have a problem of demand and affordability. And so these things have got to come together. You may be surprised to learn that Māori home ownership now has reduced to below 30%. Pacific Island home ownership in this country has reduced to below 20%, while European Pākehā home ownership is more than double that at 57%. The drop since 1986 for Māori, the drop in home ownership has been 20%. The drop for Pacific people has been 38%. This demonstrates a really substantial ethnic bias, and a Three Tikanga church must address this. It is actually unintentional asset stripping that's going on. So while we've got all sorts of really good programs and different things that are trying to bring equity in our society, Māori and Pacific Island people are losing assets. And when we talk about equality, it's not just income equality, it's asset equality that's also critical to the whole situation. So that's where a solution to the problem requires opportunity for people to buy their own homes. Now, we could do that in New Zealand all that period from after the war, from the 50s right through to the late 1980s. There were all sorts of products. You'll remember many of them. Capitalising the family benefit, low interest state advances loans, Māori affairs loans, all those things. It enabled low income people to get on the asset ladder. And so when they paid mortgages over time, they were often paying less than renters. And people on mortgages today, many of them, are paying less than renters. But they're gaining an asset at the time. And the only way poor people gain an asset is through housing. So we recommended rent-to-buy schemes. Rent-to-buy in state houses, rent-to-buy shared equity schemes in the private sector, and arrangements with equity sharing with government. So, for example, people who can't afford a mortgage at the full rate could perhaps afford 70% of the rate. The government come in and lend at 30%. And when the house is sold, the government gets whatever's accrued from 30% of the increased value, and the family gets 70%. And that enables them then to move out into another house and so on. It helps people move out of state housing if they start getting some equity because they get enough money for a deposit and can move on. So it's the combination of housing and income that's absolutely critical to lift people out of poverty. Now, the other things just to say and to summarise quickly is the recommendations of the WEAG report are to start having a system that actually informs people of their entitlement, doesn't hide their entitlements, as tends to be the case was tended to be the case over quite a number of years. So people are informed of their entitlements, that they're treated with dignity, they're treated as customers, that the onus is upon the people in the ministry who handle the benefit system to ensure that entitlements are there and that people are treated with dignity, and the beneficiaries themselves are not pushed with excessive sanctions and demands and all sorts of paperwork that's completely unnecessary, so that you get a benefit system that's fit for purpose. They're treated with dignity, they have entitlements, the income is adequate, and it's not being gobbled up in housing, and people are developing modest incomes and security of tenure. Now, there are a whole lot of other interfaces with this that we also worked on in terms of health, in terms of justice, and in terms of education. All of these interfaces are really important. Now, the critical thing that we've come to you at these synods with is we need the government to act on it. They called for the report. We've done the work. They've received the report, and they've said that they appreciate the report, they like the report, and they've indicated that they want to act on it. But they didn't act very much in the previous budget. Of course, we only delivered the report at the end of February, and they like a longer time in order to prepare for a budget. So this budget coming up in 2020 is absolutely crucial, that they act very strongly in this budget. So this Synod motion is that this Synod requests the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance to implement the findings of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group to substantially reduce poverty and to provide affordable housing in New Zealand in Budget 2020, and to phase in further improvements in the successive years. If you want to know more about the details, just go to Google and go WEAG, W-E-A-G. You'll see the whole report. It's all online. It's completely open. What I've done is summarize some of the critical aspects of it, and we really feel that if the synods pass these motions and our bishops express that motion being passed to the government, it adds weight, democratic weight, and democratic weight from an important stakeholder, but not a biased group, and a group that's got a lot of middle-class people as well as a whole range of tikanga. And if we do that, then we think that will have an important influence on government. And so I commend the motion to you, and thank you for listening to me throughout this video.